Here, and today we're going to be talking about a long paper called The Conflict of Mind on the Faulty Mechanisms of Thought and Resulting Reasonableness of Moderation. If X is true, if a certain thing is true, but there's no evidence verifying that premise, then it is irrational, intellectually irresponsible, and correct to believe the premise. We often think that it's only possible for something to be intellectually responsible, epistemologically ethical, to believe something that the evidence follows, and indeed that is the case. But it's certainly very possible for things to be true that there are no evidence for. But we tend to conflate intellectual responsibility with correctness, when it's very, very possible that there be something true that there's no evidence for, and therefore it's irresponsible to believe, and yet it is all the same true. It is all the same true. And a conflict of mind situation, as in the paper we'll go through a number of examples of this, is a situation where intellectual responsibility or epistemic responsibility motivates someone to have to confront a intellectual impracticality, a intellectual impossibility, or just a direct falsehood, to believe something that is not true. We like to think that if we are intellectually responsible, and therefore if we are reasonable and rational, that this will necessarily lead us in a more correct, more true direction. But I think this is a myth. I think it's a myth we like to believe, because the idea that thinking well and being intellectually responsible could contribute to mistake, or contribute to being caught up in exploring ideas of which there is no end to, that can go on forever and ever, as I call a Pritchard risk, based on the crying of Lot 49, is fairly existentially terrifying and very problematic. I think also it flies in the face of the dream of the Enlightenment, which is the idea that rationality can guide us, that there's basically something divine about rationality, that it does not entail, any essential problems, that if only we could do it well, then we could make the world a better place. And this paper would certainly fall in line with the counter-enlightenment that we see in Scotland with the Scottish Enlightenment, Vico, obviously David Hume, people like that, who really questioned the ability of reason to make the world a better place, and in fact saw some major problems with it. I'm not going to go through the entire argument of the conflict of mind. There's a number of examples it gives on why rationality entails what I'm going to call essential limits, that in the very structure of rationality itself, there are essential problems that just doing rationality well will not solve. Now, at the same time, the answer is not to do away with rationality entirely, because rationality has an essential role in political, social, personal life, and I think it's actually very good for mental health, but it is to say that it alone cannot make the world a better place. What I will jump to say is that if it is indeed the case that rationality entails essential limits, then moderation, middle grounds, compromise, all of these ideas that you hear a lot today as being valuable in democracy and political life, become rational, become justified. I think today a lot of people like to proclaim the importance of independent thinking, middle grounds, compromise, and stuff like that, but not really give an explanation of why. I've heard this before. I can't remember who said it. I guess Goldberg. Yes, I think it was Goldberg, who said, if one person wants to make a bridge and another person doesn't want to make a bridge, then a compromise would build half a bridge. Well, half a bridge is pretty useless. And so he was really critiquing the idea that we assume today that if it's in the middle, if we reach a middle ground, that it's the best of all possible conclusions, outcomes, but that doesn't necessarily follow. And in fact, it often just comes from an emotional place, but it's not going to be justified, and I don't think it's going to last, because if everyone knows we're just looking for a middle ground because we can't overcome our differences, then it's going to actually feel irrational. It's going to feel cheap. It's going to be like a cheap compromise. You have that Bonhoeffer distinction between costly grace and cheap grace. Well, here you could talk about a costly middle ground and a cheap middle ground. But if, in fact, rationality itself, thought itself, entails essential limits, then middle grounds and compromises are rationally justified, not just socially necessary. There is a rational justification for why we have to give into it. Because if there are certain conclusions that we cannot reach because of, or be sure about, or so forth, because of the very nature of thought itself, then to consider middle grounds or to look for various compromises is a necessary tragedy, if you will, a necessary outcome of people of whom have inessential essentially limited rationalities trying to come together. So suddenly we have a rational and intellectually coherent and justified justification for democratic compromise. And the paper also talks about Hunter, his book Before the Shooting Begins, and he talks about the need for substantive democracy, which is in opposition to this sort of weak democratic compromise. And I think really understanding what we learned from the counter-enlightenment, and there's a paper I also did called Deconstructing Common Life that gives sort of what follows if rationality entails certain essential limits. Well, then we can have a robust democracy that doesn't feel cheap, and we can reach agreements and compromises between one another and not feel like we're betraying one another or betraying what we believe. In fact, we will understand it's just a necessary tragedy that is rationally justified because of these essential limits. So that's going to be the overarching idea of the paper. There's a lot more in the paper that's going to go through why these limits in fact exist and why the dream of the Enlightenment is in fact a myth. And I encourage you to read the paper at ogrose.com, and I thank you for your time.